Ja, även Chini meștești de care Chini meștești să știm că și noi facem să se simtă. So thank you so much for the time you've taken, the welcome, and also just to give a little bit of background. My profession is as a medicine, which is yeah. Central is actually violence. And grounding is a first in the wet lab, studying flowers, constituent cells, and realizing I even had a couple of patents of my own, and in the targeted chemotherapeutic space that cancer biology is so attractive. And I realized that I didn't ever want to set up one ever again. I didn't want to ever become a scientist because Native people believe if we're ever called up with their education, our paths are usually as doctor, lawyer, engineer, teacher, like never as a scientist. And then I went back for my first master's in bioethics, studying genealogists and indigenous communities, and realized, wow, genomics is even worse than cancer biology. And particularly in population genetics. And I did my second master's in public health and biology and also PhD in genomics and health disparities at Vanderbilt University, which is the best and the worst place to get that kind of training, just because, great in terms of computational approaches relates to genetics and genomics. Horrible because there are no indigenous nations. So if I want to do community engaged work with genetics and genomics, really not a great space for it, really wasn't the time for it. So now we're getting into an interesting part where now we have the largest cadre and cohort of indigenous geneticists and scientists to actually be able to create benefit and beneficial impacts in this space. If only we could just sleep a little. So if I could just briefly touch upon, we always think about the terms discoveries in terms of the doctrine of discovery, preempted and deed rights for two European nations, superseding authority over us barbarous and our lands and everything on it. And the U.S. Supreme Court, from its inception to where even in 2005 and 2007, U.S. Supreme Court actually utilized the doctrine of discovery to disenfranchise indigenous peoples, other lands, and nations, most recently used to disenfranchise United Nations claims. And when the Pope sort of repudiated this past, First Nations and Indigenous nations everywhere were like, great, where's our land back? Where's it due back? Where's everything that you take from it back? And it's really interesting to think about in terms of genomic discoveries, that now this discussion of uncovering hidden genetic variation, those types of research questions are also grounded and require the incorporation of indigenous peoples first and foremost. And then you see the cycle of extraction and biocolonialism and biopiracy over and over again. But we also see it in our natural history collection. So I'm in usually the human space. Sometimes I go into the non-human space just because these questions of data collection, data harmonizations, data use, right, are just less regulated in the non-human space. So we're going to be approaching these questions quicker. So in this kind of context, I love going to large sequencing centers like the Center for Biology, like Biodiversity, Genomics, and well, thank you for that invite. Just telling scientists, you're helping yourself to knowledge is not yours. And we see it plastered over and over again in art, in giving and conferring expertise onto white scientists for knowledges that are effectively our people's. And we see this over and over again to the subjugation of our people, such that before settlers arrived, we had so much biodiversity in our spaces. Over 30,000 edible plants worldwide, yet our ecosystems are considered backwards or primitives. And it was further like just demonized on the advent of the Green Revolution, which was this white sort of savior notion that we were going to end hunger and worldwide famine. And yet what we see actually is just increased power inequities and wealth concentrated by corporations and big agriculture. And we see a loss of biodiversity and also increases in the greenhouse emissions to the detriment of our earth. And it's so interesting with CRISPR and gene editing approaches. We are now looking to Indigenous peoples to rescue monoculture and rescue biodiversity. And Indigenous knowledges and articles all over the world, our newspaper articles are calling our knowledges as key to that sustainability, which is so hypocritical to the narrative that was perpetuated onto us without our choice. So we see seeds and varietals of our people, of our Indian community members, which stewarded potato plants to be reintroduced and CRISPR back into monoculture for the benefits of those corporations. And this is so interesting because when we think about the Oprah of it all, the helping themselves to our genomic information, we can see it, this narrative over and over and over again in this open data era, this open access climate. It's like you get a genomic and you get a genomic data set. Look on your chairs, there's a data set belonging coming from Indigenous people. And unsurprisingly, nations around the world are responding to this and creating policies and exercising their sovereignty and their governances in order to restrict open data sharing. Now, this is this narrative now is that we are anti-progress. We as Indigenous scientists, Indigenous people are anti-science, but we're not anti to that type of work. We're anti to the extraction, we're anti to the colonialism, we're anti to this story that we can see unfold cyclically out of us if we don't do anything. Because now over 80% of the world's biodiversity is on lands that are stewarded by Indigenous peoples. So the next genomic discoveries are going to come up our knowledges and disenfranchise tribal rights. And we're often the last of benefits, and we're often the least protected from conflicts. So when we think about this collection of data, we always ask, who is this benefiting? There have been tons and tons of stories over and over again of scientists having conversations with our communities and taking our blood and our DNA, have promising medicines and therapeutics to cure the conditions that are afflicting our peoples. Just this narrative came from point A to point C is never actually, there's really no steps in it. And I asked scientists over and over again, how are we ensuring that the benefits are impacting the people directly? And always the response to it's not our domain. Like our responsibility is publishing that next little step in a peer-reviewed publication that no subcommittee member could read, that's outside our disciplines, beyond paywalls, and then somehow, somewhere down the line, that's going to translate to benefits through therapeutics, through big pharma, for drugs that Indigenous people, in my opinion, cannot afford. So we see then that the first entities to benefit are not the people that are giving that information to begin with, which is absolutely wrong from an ethical point of view. How can we say that that is not ethical? That is completely extractive. And Darren is colonial over and over again to white scientists. So, and how do we ensure that benefits, benefit us fairly little? Because I know that I'm going to think about their larger effect later on. But this is a scene, if you don't recognize it from the movie Despicable Me, with the pillars of the Lehman Brothers and constantly squishing us like the room walks on a little bit and speak on. I feel like if you're moving from left to right, if you Indigenous peoples in the rightmost part of the city are feeling this switch. Because universities, through the Rainbow Act, can claim IP from federally funded research. And unsurprisingly, largely the teams be able to support their ability to claim that IP. Corporations have already, trashed them out. We already know they have our legal teams, but it's really interesting because as somebody that worked on the other side as an industry programmer, I can tell you that industry research is not as regulated as academic spaces. It's almost the Wild West of what you can get away with, unfortunately. But also, they can get access to public data sets through organization, or they can find available on proprietary information. So, they're unilaterally benefiting from open data. And again, people actually to support that, but Indigenous peoples, first of all, sometimes our existences are not even recognized by form of governments. Neither is our right to sovereignty or self-governance. The concept of ownership is already incongruent with how we function for millennia. It's kind of immemorial. And it's really hard to establish that requirement of novelty, especially for genetically associated indigenous knowledges that we have been practicing and utilized for centuries and longer. So, and notwithstanding, it requires large legal teams. Some of our nations are so small that we're lucky to have even one or two tribal lawyers to come back to our communities. Now, ask them to stack on their legal information, biology, and that's a lot for one person to have mastery of. So now when we consider at the international level, so the Nagoya Protocol is a framework that formalizes fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from biological diversity, but it's also one that the US hasn't been signed on to, which is incredibly interesting. So of course the question when we're talking about how do we actually think about return of benefits and samples in communities that respect to problems of this data, like how can we do this? How can we operationalize linguistic? How can we operationalize and take us on? So one way is through having Indigenous led biological data repositories. So this is the Native Biology Consortium, of which I'm a co-founder and also an ethics and policy director. It is a lab in central South Dakota, in a part of the Shawnee Sioux tribe. And we have been in operation since 2018, and now we have over 9 employees, and we've been able to introduce how we can put sequencing to a remote evolution for the first time that we know in the US. And when we are thinking about in terms of consent and broad consent, we know that we can change this, that we can do more effective forms of consent, more responsive community member states. So when we're thinking about data management and governance, so we're trying to formalize, we're thinking of now also including dynamic consenting, so that participants can actually have more tailored approaches to what types of studies their data is going to be used for, and it can change the preferences moving forward. And then we're talking about creating our own data servers to hold our own data. We can now employ and stack on that machine learning approaches related to blockchain and federated learning, and have those rules, those execute rules now like on the lever of community members themselves. So those rules written by community members themselves as opposed to some other entity. But then in terms of local context and what we can do with labels, we could start also thinking about putting labels on the provenance of the data to also tag those data with attribution and use rights alongside this data. And this is incredibly interesting when we think about this international consortia for collectivizing genomic information. The Earthbound Genome Project has a very lofty motto of sequencing life for the future of life. But when I saw this as an Indigenous person, I'm like, oh, now they're helping themselves to our information, our Indigenous genomes, the genomes that we steward, but on an international scale, at a grandiose, egocentric, scale, and it's touching scary. So I'm really fortunate that I'm at Arizona State University, which is another story in itself, if you know the history of it, but also working with but now I have the ability to sort of which in our professional expertise that we have acquired in these colonial spaces. And now we can start sort of publishing in their spaces the practices and guidelines that they need to do. And everything just so that we can tell them, hey, you don't need another lawsuit. Hey, private natures are becoming more litigious and tracking more and more about where the data is coming from and how it's being used. Like, you need to be more respectful, but also, you know, there are good researchers out there. There are, I know them, I know them personally, and by setting the groundwork, a foundational form of ethical practices, we can really move the field forward. And we start thinking about data as a resource. We can start thinking about building economies of locally trained people to actually steward the data locally, have more data experts. And we can think about now cloud infrastructures that are Indigenous held. I mean, let's start also by thinking of our students as those next leaders in data science. So this is Digidata, which is a series of workshops I start with a number of other Indigenous data scientists. We are now in our third year, and we are doing a workshop this summer. But the questions of interest are those that are centered in Indigenous communities. We have one nation in Lower Nation territory talking about the use of metabarcoding and fisheries and waterways management, and then also Shakopee lands relating to CRISPRing and also gene editing and genetic modification. We're really thinking about Indigenous peoples and diverse peoples to do selective breeding and these other forms of techniques. And we're really changing the narrative because we know that if we want to truly impact equity and innovation, we have to also think about progressing across 3 different axes, not just engagement equity, but also decision-making equity in terms of those data governance foundational rules, and also benefit equity. And absent progress along one of the 3 of these axes, we're just in the development status quo. So thank you, and also we have stickers. That's my information.
Thank you everyone. Thank you everyone who's spoken to us far. Thanks everyone for being here. And we heard about labels and visual tools as activators change, and how much potential and how many possibilities there are with correct attributions and verification processes. Because we have just a few moments, about 15 minutes or so, to open up into discussion or questions about application of labels, collaborations, anything that you've heard from any of the speakers for all of you.
I would like to ask, how many universities or colleges are there with collections that belong to Indigenous peoples, with which there could be a similar initiative? And anyone of you is related to it?
I'll take a gander at that. All of them. Start there. I do think you know, and Krystal alluded to this sort of the frameworks that were set up earlier too are based around abstraction, and the university is a critical colonial tool for holding and keeping from, right? So, you know, those of us that do this work in the context of universities, it's the story I tell myself. It's like a manager at a mid-level paper company in Scranton. But that you know, so much of the initial steps are set, even like I know that they'll say no to the thing. Right? So then you could be like, oh, how do we get to the yes part of this? Because it's just the practice and structure is set up around. We have it now, and you know, that's such a firm thing, and Krystal alluded to this, we'll talk about it, I think, this afternoon, they're invested in the collectivization of our knowledge towards, you know, away from us, towards some general public somewhere for profit, et cetera, et cetera. So, yet reversing that flow is threatening in ways that they don't even know. Yet, you know, it's like you ask, well, can we do it that way? Right? And I'm sure you have some of these stories that are like, well, what will, you know, like, you know, just the special collections librarian thinks the world is falling. You know, if I say like, you can't show that to anyone, 'cause she's like, well, my job is to show it to people. You know, like it's these are great people. They're ethical. They see themselves serving the public as by presenting information to as broad a public as possible. So there is this reorientation that you have to work with them along this way, and so it's such a tricky thing. So I guess I would do more of an explanation. I still want to say all of them, but I'd say you know, there are other ways to answer them.
So it's really interesting. Sometimes I hear stories that museums, they do have, like for instance, our ancestors in collections, and they're scared to disclose their connection to contemporary descendant communities, because the concern is, well, then the descendants will want them back, and it's almost like this hoarding process, because particularly DNA, it has a relatively short half-life, right? That Indigenous ancestors are just almost traded among non-Indigenous peoples as almost gold. And the concern is, well, if they are repatriated back to their home communities, that then they'll be lost to the subject of scientific study and progress, and lost to the potential of individuals that write New York Times best-selling books about our histories, which is incredibly full of hubris when you consider like how many people are interested in the story of mankind, of Indigenous peoples. We have our own stories. This is like a story of you all. But the interesting thing here is not just the MOUs and the data use agreements that usually get written without us at the table to represent directly, but also the interesting data definitions that are structured against us. So, for instance, with collection DNA from living individuals, yes, there is informed consent, but also, you know, if you're using an informed consent form that was written in the 90s or from a tissue collection in the 70s from a clinic, and it has like a very broad use term of like, you consent to your use for genomic studies. That term means something different when genomic technologies were relatively more rudimentary to where we are now, and where we can interrogate like not only information that identifies the individual, but everyone the biologically related to, which reopens to community risk and genomic racial profiling, and having these biological mediated narratives that might substantiate negative stereotypes for our people using DNA, and can we use to disenfranchise our land rights, right? But very interesting that on top of that, like there are ways in which at the NIH level and at the federal level, in which we have something called the single IRB mandate, by which a university can just say, hey, yeah, we recognize your tribal IRB or RIB, but you know, we have a policy as an institution to refuse to see review to any other IRB. How is that respecting tribal IRBs? And big institutions do that all the time. And then that's just for humans that can consent, for our ancestors who cannot consent, for unfortunately termed non-human subjects research, which is ridiculous because they're from sequence. then they don't have to go through a rigorous IRB approval of the institution. And then again, we're back to the whole hoarding of information. And it's really interesting because the definitions are not consistent. If you think about the gut microbiome information, it's considered non-human subjects in the US, but everywhere, many other nations and across the world consider as human subjects. You literally divide them themselves. So, information. So anyway, there's a lot of ins and outs and loopholes, and these types of legal sort of mouse hunting of like trying to get around rules and tribal sovereignty and bypassing it. It happens all the time, and it's exhausting, but also requires like knowledgeable individuals who are placed in these decision-making pathways to be able to foresee that. And that's another good thing about the labels too, is because then we can actually label the data itself and track it as it goes along with the data. And it can potentially also help us with some of this provenance and the tracking of the data back to communities.
And then some of the work from my department, because I'm coming at this from like a tribal libraries, archives, and museums context. So working within a sovereign tribal government and doing those relationships with external institutions such as university museums or state museums, or even like just local private. And that also includes archives as well. So I've come across that attitude of hoarding and protecting, and knowing that archivists have this need to create access to everything, but without realizing, well, when you ask them, well, how are you creating access to the tribal communities whose information this is, whose knowledge this is, you're actually creating barriers, and you're upholding those barriers to that knowledge, to the people who can use it the best, and also interpret it in a way that is culturally relevant. And so it also goes into like partnership building as well, building those relationships, because sometimes it requires like, well, what is your retention schedule? Because we've run across where local records repositories like within the state will have actually disposed of some of our materials, where fortunately we had allies who were familiar with our history, who actually alerted other folks within the town to like get the Indian proprietor records out of the dumpster. And then with the allyship with like the local select board of the town, and then like the Massachusetts state rep Smitty Pegnatelli was able to go to the state of Massachusetts and pass legislature that any archival materials regarding like art history to a certain date and prior will automatically be given over to the tribe, which is a really beautiful example of what allyship looks like and how that can benefit tribal museums, because we don't even know till this day how much Indigenous archival materials has ended up in the dumpster, especially when you're thinking of all the tribal nations who were dispossessed of their lands and pushed out west in order to suit this American mythology that was being developed in the 1700s and 1800s. And we've also usually like examples of like other partnership collaborations between tribes and external institutions have really helped to reassure some of those worries of like people working in like archives or like in the universities or museums. Because what we've seen within like the past 10 years is like all of the shared mutual benefits. I think there's always been this fear of like lack of resources, lack of, I guess, accessibility, or even like lack of, I guess, I guess there's always this fear that they're gonna lose out, when in fact, like when you collaborate with tribal nations and you work with tribal nations on what those agreements are and returning materials, whether they be like digital surrogates or even like making sure that if this ever comes up for return for removal of the collections, make sure it gets returned back to the tribe. So this is talking about materials that do not fall underneath the NAGPRA, that cannot be repatriated. But however, we're finding more and more of those knowledges do actually fit in with that scope, because it might not be the item or the ancestor themselves, it's documented materials about that ancestor or about those items, so those are connected. So hopefully, you know, there's some redoing of like some of those laws here in America that, as far as determining what can be repatriated. But then also, if we've seen where collaborating with tribes actually helps the universities to ensure that what they're doing is ethical. And that also, that the knowledge that is being produced is actually going directly back to the community and supporting all of like these rematriation and reclamation efforts for tribal nations, so that we can preserve and enrich our culture. And that's one thing we always hear, well, Indigenous peoples are at the forefront for climate resilience or for biodiversity. Well, we need access to all that data and that information if everybody in the world's going to be coming to Indigenous peoples. Like keeping the door shut to us is not helping anybody.
You were just speaking about agreements, and Darren said something about, you know, don't start with an LU. So I wonder if you could just speak briefly, what do you start with?
Like usually it starts with assessing what is out there and then cold calling and see, and also looking at what projects that organization, that institution has already had in place and prioritizing who is gonna be the best partner to work with, because we want institutions that have already done their groundwork in ensuring that they know how to be an ally to Indigenous peoples. They know about Indigenous sovereignty. They know about the issues that are affecting Indigenous cultural heritage, Indigenous like data. And so those are the ones we want to go to. Otherwise, it just becomes this relationship of extraction, where it's like, it's not the Indigenous people's job to teach people how to come correct. Like that's the institution's work. That's like the work of like these departments of diversity, equity, and inclusion. They should be the ones informing and educating the whole college community, from the leadership all the way down to the students, even the families of the students, I would say, with any kind of like public outreach engagement that they do.
Did you want to say how do we start these things? I mean, there's so many ways to start it. I'll say, you know, there was a role for our Indigenous activists that call upon from outside the university for an ethical relationship. There is people like, you know, inside like me, or like, give us our plan back, and they're like, oh, you can't do that. Well, what? How about data sovereignty? You know, I mean, we do all sorts of little things. I think education is key, and I think understanding, you know, and who educates, I think is really important. But the I always find that the varieties of pressures that are critical to this. So and I think that sounds, I throw a lot of mud at the wall for any of these projects, and I should be more strategic. I'm very strategic also, but the idea that we could just, you know, the pathways are always going to be dependent upon that institution, that Indigenous context, territory, grouping. So I think, it's very, but it takes collective efforts. From a variety of situations, when I think about the universities, as a place, that is, recognizably exploitative and, slow to change, despite, all you crazy leftists, working in the university. It's this dissonance that defines the university that also creates, I think, potential pathways for its evolution.
In that variety of pressures, I want to uplift these activist stickers that are back and the not verified stickers. Love that so much. And just before we move to lunch, just wanted to offer if any of you have any provocations or just questions or something to give to this group of people on the folks to me and so they go away and continue to
For an instruction. We need more education about why we're giving up our DNA freely to companies like 23andMe and Ancestry. I understand that there are displaced individuals that want to reconnect with their communities, but Ancestry is not, the genetic ancestry testing is not that way, and we are literally, when we give our DNA to these companies, paying them to sell our data downstream for unconsented purposes. And we have to think, when we are giving up our DNA to these tests, who is getting access to this and who is profiting from this? And we need to start asking questions from everybody that has this information in the us to do.
We're going to move into lunch and we'll be back at 1:30. Are there any instructions for lunch? No. Have a wonderful time. We'll see you.